Hi Internet, I'm Dave, and welcome to Chapter 2 of The Masks of New Zenith. If you haven't watched the other videos yet, go back and check those out. They'll give you the full impact of the story, and it'll explain exactly what's going on here. And today we are going to be jumping into a new character's point of view. This is going to happen a lot with the first couple of videos as the story gets started, but just remember that at the end of the day, this is a novel, so you're not going to get all the information right off the bat. But stick with me because sooner or later you'll get all of it, eventually. Who knows when? I'm going to make a lot of these. Now, one thing I just want to point out before I jump into chapter number 2 is the timeline of this book. The prologue took place in March, and the first chapter took place in June. Even though those ones follow each other with gaps in between, not all of this story takes place in a linear time. It kind of jumps around. You'll get things that happened in the past that talk about the present, sort of like that. So you gotta pay a little bit of attention to exactly what month and what date it is in order to know where we are in the story, but it's easy to follow. You just have to listen to what I'm saying. So, not to waste any more time and to just do it as quickly as possible, let's jump right into Chapter 2. Masks of New Zenith, Chapter 2. Fall from Saturn, Issue 1. Rook Zenith thumbed through the file he'd been passed. It was the same standard off-yellow pamphlet he'd seen billions of times before, containing files he'd also seen billions of times before. There were medical charts showing how smooth and efficient surgery would be to replicate the machines in his arms. Doctors' signatures were put on every sheet. A few were written-up reports from the Secretary of Defense, stating how every soldier to receive the treatment would be a willing participant, and only those involved in the armed forces would be scheduled for the operations. There was even a very formal and well-versed cover letter from the president, expressing how this would be helping the country's national security and how great of a service the captain would be performing by agreeing to have his arms reverse-engineered. It was all for the greater good of mankind and for America's future. It was perfect. They should have wrapped a bow on it. Captain Zenith gently put the file on the table and slid it a few feet away from him. No. I think you should reconsider this time, Mr. Matsuda said. Do you now? The Chief of Intercommunicational Relations and Departmental Cohabilitation, try saying that 3 times fast, sat at the oblong table with 4 other suits. Each one, of course, held an integral role in the politics of the great city of New Zenith, and a little further beyond its borders as well. To Rook's left sat Anna Petrov, his former colleague in battle. She was retired now, just like him, though Rook often wondered if she knew how to swing her electrified warhammer like the good old days. On his right was Thaddeus Richmore, or Thad for short. A new kid to the world of files and straight-laced ties, Thad was Rook's right hand when it came to getting matters done. A glorified assistant, of course, and Thad knew it. But the young man felt a great deal of pride, saying that he was helping the great Captain Zenith. Even if the fight had moved to boardrooms and business chairs these days. You see, Captain, Mr. Matsuda continued, your time's technology is, of course, fascinating, and obviously light years ahead of what the modern day could hope to achieve. But it should be said that with a little reverse engineering, we have gone a long way. Your ship introduced us to advanced flying technology some 20 years earlier than in your timeline, correct? 30, actually, Anna corrected. 30, thank you, Miss Petrov, even better. Matsuda began to circle the room as he spoke, gesturing out the windows and down to the bustling city before them. Captain, your city, and I call it your city given how it was renamed after you. I'm aware of my own history, Mr. Matsuda. Get to the point, would you? Of course. Captain, we want to make this city, nay, this whole country, a better and safer place for everyone within it. Now, they say that to move forward, man must draw lessons from the past. But I say we look to the future instead. Your people outfitted your very arms with every conceivable tool a person may ever need. Granted, the intention for them were for engineering purposes at the time. But for decades, you demonstrated time and time again how these tools can be used for, let's call them, military operations. The older Japanese man turned back to the superhuman that he addressed. Captain, we need to face facts. The old days are done. Saturn is no more. The glory days of our great nation working with the rest of the world are gone and buried. Gone the way of the dinosaur, one might say. But the world is still in need of heroes. Who do we turn to? These new vigilantes that spring out of the shadows? Well, their intentions may be well and good, but their means of execution are nothing short of questionable. All we are asking is that you, Captain Zenith, bestow upon the world the great attributes that make you the hero everyone still loves and respects. Yes, by letting you put my people's technology into your soldiers. I fail to see how that will better strengthen our people's security. Frankly, it sounds to me like you just want better weapons for your soldiers. I'm sure it must seem that way. What was the proposal you presented to me last month, Mr. Matsuda? I believe it was having scientists look at my physique to figure out what gives me my strength and speed as well. The month before that, I believe it was the 100th proposal to look into the remnants of my ship once more, and try and see if any of the equipment could be augmented into some sort of defensive technology. Captain Zenith, if I may, before that, it was wanting to look at the wing mechanics to determine if your present aircrafts could have their maneuverability improved in some way. Then, if I'm remembering correctly, it was modestly asking if you could examine Saturn's vault in South Africa to glance at some of the weapons we had collected over the years, just in case any of our greatest enemies might have created something that could be of benefit to our nation. Is that right, Mr. Matsuda? Captain, Rook. May I call you Rook? No, you may not. The other suits all exchanged glances and readjusted themselves in their seats. Now listen to me for a change. Every month I've had to listen to some kind of proposal to advance the US of A's resources by taking bits and pieces off myself and the only piece of my time that I have left. I have been hearing it for almost 70 years, Mr. Matsuda, stretching all the way back to when the first idiot scientists wanted to study me because they believed me being black had something to do with my ability to stop a freight train and walk away with barely a scratch. You could have heard a pin drop. Mr. Matsuda knew that this wasn't a fight he was going to win, but he was a little too nervous to even return to his seat. He just stood by the window like a bad piece of art. Like every proposal before, Mr. Matsuda, I'm afraid I must decline. Your job title, what was it again? I am the Chief of Intercommunicational Relations. Captain Zenith held up a hand. Let's just call it what it is. Your job is to take all the ideas from anyone who has them and pass them along to the current Saturn members still functional enough to make a decision, which as it stands, at least in this country, is only Miss Petrov and myself. Thad cleared his throat timidly and drew a few looks over to him. Don't forget about Major Soldat, sir. I suppose that's true, Thad, the captain acknowledged. Despite hanging up his wings, Major Ethan Soldat would be considered a member, though retirement and board meetings has never really suited a man of such tenacity, Miss Petrov suggested. Captain Zenith pointed to her. Tenacity, exactly. But let's not get sidetracked. As I was saying, Mr. Matsuda, your job is nothing more than a glorified go-between, is it not? Well, sir, that was rhetorical. Allow me to remind you that as a go-between, your job is not to convince me of anything I don't want to hear. You are a messenger, nothing more. And while I need not shoot the messenger, I also need not hear any more from him than I care to. Rook slid the paper across the table so it rested in front of Mr. Matsuda. You can take this back to the officials that cleared it and tell them from me to stop prying their fingers into my body or my culture. Trust me, we valued our privacy in the 28th century just as much as you all do now. And frankly, I'm getting tired of having to defend my right to hold on to my own property. The captain may as well have slammed a judge's gavel down. A man like Jacob Matsuda knew better than to argue after a rant like that. This man had come from a distant future, crashed his ship into American soil, helped kick off the civil rights movement for black Americans in the 1950s, and fought in over 75 successful missions, both domestic and overseas, to stop terrorist attacks against the greater good of mankind. To top it all off, he was at least over 100 at this point and didn't look a day over 40. You don't push a man like that once he's made up his mind. "I understand, Captain," was all Matsuda could muster as he took the dossier back. "Apologies. I'll pass your response on to my superiors." Jacob Matsuda walked back around the table and took his seat once more. Rook looked at his watch. Just 7:15 in the evening on May 15th. The afternoon sky was overcast in bluish-gray clouds, and the subtlest patter of rain was falling outside. Enough to say that it was raining, but not enough to take out an umbrella. "Now then," he continued, "shall we move on to other business?" "We're making strong headway with the housing development on the northern side," the younger Mr. Strauss chirped up, sensing that the ball needed to keep rolling. "So far, we've broken ground on 5 of the 8 planned neighborhoods, and we've made some real traction with the Church of St. Paul. Many homeless people and low-income families have already heard about the affordable range for the area." "What about the last 3 neighborhoods?" the captain asked. Alex Strauss broke eye contact for a few seconds, trying to put a good spin on what he was about to say. "We've been running into some, let's call them issues." "What sort of issues?" Miss Petrov asked. "If I may," Thad spoke up again. He reached down to his briefcase and snapped the 2 brass locks up. He removed a small stack of photos. "Mr. Strauss informed me of the problems already, Captain. Apologies for not showing you sooner, but I felt it would be best to reveal it to everyone at the same time." Thad passed the images over to Captain Zenith, who laid them out so both he and Anna could see. The last 3 designated build sites were the ones purchased from Douglas Heft. As you'll recall, he didn't exactly make the negotiations easy. Captain Zenith and Anna Petrov looked from one photograph to the next. Each showed a clear image of vandalism and acts of violence. A cement mixer with a large hole blown out the side, a construction worker with a black eye, and several bandages wrapped around his head. There were 10 images in all, each one showing the slow progress and severe injuries to the laborers. "You think Douglas Heft is responsible for these acts?" Zenith asked. "There's no direct evidence tying him to them, Captain," Mr. Strauss replied. "But it would make the most sense. The longer it takes to get these houses built, the easier time Heft would have to get his buildings back. Through various means, obviously." "Obviously." Captain Zenith rubbed his eyes. He was more than familiar with Douglas Heft, and the number of times he had shown up in the media involved in one scandal or another. "We'll have to increase security. Director Larchmont." "Yes, Captain." The 3rd suit in question was a barrel-chested man with a row of medals over his left breast. He had served in New Zenith's police department for over 40 years and was now deputy director of the entire operation. His hair was only just starting to gray around the temples, but other than that he had sported the same brown crew cut for the entire time the captain had known him. "I need you to post some officers to take care of this problem. There'll be glorified security guards for a few months, but I need this housing development taken care of. I don't like the idea of having people living on this city's streets, and the numbers grow every year." "Of course, Captain. I'll move a few of our better officers around and set up a task force to keep any of Heft's thugs from interfering." "Good." Rook turned his attention to the man sitting furthest to the right side of the oblong table. "Any new data from the robotics program, Dr. Smith?" "Few and far between, but yes," the doctor replied. He was New Zenith's chief medical examiner with multiple PhDs. His duties nowadays required him to be the captain's eyes in experimental sciences, particularly those involved in giving people with life-threatening injuries or birth defects a second chance. "The mechanical limbs that you oversaw work perfectly on their own. Sadly, grafting them to a human host has yielded difficulty. The human body simply doesn't have enough strength to withstand or support something of such advanced engineering. The limbs in question were prototypes that Captain Zenith did his best to help create with the city's doctors and engineers in the field of advanced robotics. The limbs existed in his time and worked flawlessly due to generation after generation of human genome augmentation. But man of the 21st century had yet to reach the level that their future counterparts had achieved. Plus, the limbs weren't perfect. Despite his knowledge of the future, Captain Zenith had been a pilot and mechanic, not a doctor or engineer. He could only recall so much information. The rest was for the imaginations of other minds. "What about the steroids?" he asked, hating the word as he said it. They weren't the steroids that modern-day bodybuilders used. More of an experimental, lasting drug that increased the production of adrenaline and made the muscles denser over time. At least that was the goal. "Still in the experimentation phase, I'm afraid," Dr. Smith replied. He removed his circular-rimmed glasses and gave them a quick polish. "But honestly, the bigger problem is the candidates we are testing on. They're not very healthy specimens to begin with. If we could be allowed to use more healthy subjects—" "No," Rick stated. "But Captain, the men held prisoner in the hump exercise constantly and already receive perfectly fine medical care. How is performing augmentations like this unethical on men who have already thrown their lives away?" "Doctor, I am tired of having this conversation." Rook closed his eyes briefly and hung his head. "I'm sorry that our volunteers are the lesser fortunate, but I will not have the prisoners of this city experimented on. Despite being stripped of their civilian rights, they are still human and have dignities that are due respect. Besides, let's say the graft does work one of these days. Do you really think a death row inmate is the best person to have a cybernetically enhanced arm?" Dr. Smith held the captain's gaze for a few moments. "No, Captain Zenith, I suppose I wouldn't." The captain understood the doctor's frustration and constant need to try and push forward. The surgery was strictly voluntary, of course, but there weren't many people willing to line up to have limbs removed for the sake of progress. Even amputees were hesitant. Because of this, they often got those desperate enough to just want to get off the street. The last man had been a drunk brought into the hospital 2 months ago for alcohol poisoning. He had seemed eager to do anything for the money. Unfortunately, his liver failed the other week, and they hadn't made many advancements in that time. "You've had 3 weeks to make more progress since I last asked," Rook pointed out. "We were planning on switching to primates last week, Captain. The theory is that the density of their muscles may make it easier to use the limbs, but... well... The truck was hijacked," Director Larchmont answered for him. Rook Zenith stared at the two of them a little dumbfounded. "Hijacked," he repeated. "A truck full of chimpanzees was hijacked." "Most likely some animal rights activists," the director continued. "It was being looked into, but the trail ran cold." Captain Zenith could only sigh. "I thought rush epidemic was biggest problem in this city," Miss Petrov said, her familiar Russian accent helping the captain's irritation. "Now we may have monkeys running around too?" "Apes," Mr. Matsuda corrected, ever eager to make his voice heard. "Not monkeys, Miss Petrov." Anna showed no emotion towards him, simply cocked an unfriendly eyebrow. "How exactly was the truck hijacked?" Captain Zenith continued. "The drivers claim at gunpoint," Dr. Smith explained. "Animal rights activists don't use guns. Radicals do. Or somebody a little more extreme." "You think sabotage, Captain?" Director Larchmont asked. "I think someone knew what they were doing and wanted those primates more than we did." "We'll have to get a new batch, Doctor. And this time we'll have to make sure that the drivers and handlers are armed." "You think that wise, Captain?" Dr. Smith asked. "I don't see much other choice. Who knows why those apes were kidnapped? I just know we can't let it happen again if we're to continue with the robotics program." Dr. Smith nodded. "Understood, sir. I'll put through the order post-haste." Captain Zenith nodded in return. There was but one more order of business to go over, and he turned his attention to the last person in the room. "Mr. Hall," he said. "First of all, thank you for joining us today and waiting so patiently. I'm sure this must be a big change of scenery for you." Just a bit. Most skyscrapers I'm in don't have walls on them yet, the gruff man said. But I'm not going to turn down an invitation from the great Captain Zenith. Dick Hall was a man of wild black hair and a tremendous beard that hung down to his nipples. Had he flexed his muscles, he would probably rip his suit jacket apart. Mr. Hall was an independent contractor who was responsible for several of New Zenith's skyscrapers, mini-malls, corner stores, and apartment buildings. He oversaw the designs and construction of roughly 4 projects at a time in the bustling metropolis. I'm still wondering exactly what I'm doing here, though. Dick looked at the 4 other men who shared his side of the table. Honestly, hearing about a rival company's construction projects is a little jarring. Apologies, Mr. Hall. That wasn't intended to be a slap in the face, the captain replied. We did approach you at first, Mr. Hall, but you were too busy with finishing that job on Maple, Thad pointed out. We couldn't wait for you to be finished. I guess that's true. Dick Hall leaned back in his chair. And I suppose it was a blessing in disguise, what with this Heft character. Last thing I want is my men to be victims of something like that. So what's this all about exactly? I've got a new project in mind, and I need someone of your expertise. The captain turned his gaze out to the city. As it stands, New Zenith has a population of almost 10 million people with all the resources to at least sustain that population. 9,746,819, Thad corrected, according to last year's mandatory census. Thank you, Thad, Captain Zenith responded. At the moment, we still have the means to sustain our population. But one problem that remains constant is the city's transportation. While our means of transportation are stable, my offices constantly get complaints and letters on almost a daily basis about crowded buses, cramped trains, and not enough taxi services. That's why I've decided that it is now time to break ground on New Zenith's brand new subway system. And I want you, Mr. Hall, to drop all projects you may be working on and start planning out the proper routes and locations to get this done. You will be working very closely with my offices, obviously, and if need be, I'll give you the means and resources to add more manpower to your staff. Dick Hall remained silent for a few seconds, then gave a small chuckle of laughter. Captain, cards on the table here. I know that everything you did for our country, actually our planet, went above and beyond what any normal man could have done. Nobody in this room or outside of it has the right to question you or challenge your authority. But drop all my projects for this? I'm sorry, Captain, but that's just not possible. As it stands, my team is working on a new building for the law offices of Wing and Templeton. They've demanded that it be finished in a 3-month deadline. We're also in charge of the airport's 3rd expansion, and just last week we made a deal to patch up all violations at the Queen Street sewage treatment plant. I don't mean to throw them under the bus or anything, but there are a lot of issues with that one. I'm sorry, Captain, but it just can't be done. It would ruin me. Captain Zenith waved a hand through the air. I hear what you're saying, Mr. Hall, but as I said, I will give you the means and resources to accomplish this task. That includes paying those locations you just mentioned for stealing you away, and giving you a fair sum to keep your name and business intact. Sir, I'm afraid it's a little more complicated than that. Actually, it's not. Mr. Strauss here has assured me he can find replacements for the current jobs you're overseeing, and I'm thinking a few $100,000 each should tie over your reputation. Well, I suppose that may make my clients happy, Dick Hall acquiesced. But there's also the matter of my compensation. I can't just walk away from these jobs. I'll lose out on thousands of... We're prepared to offer you 3 times the amount you would lose, Mr. Hall. We are? And Miss Petrov asked. She and Thad exchanged a look of uncertainty. Captain, Thad began, when we discussed the subway plan, we never said anything about a bailout of such magnitude. Captain Zenith simply raised a hand in the young man's direction. The conversation ended then and there. What do you say, Mr. Hall? I believe somewhere in the ballpark of $5 million is reasonable. Another exchanged glance from Anna and Thad. Even the suits made small grunting noises. Captain Zenith, we can't afford to spend that much of the city's money on something like this, Mr. Matsuda stated. The city will only be contributing 1 million, Mr. Matsuda, the captain explained. The rest will be coming from my own personal account, as well as the reserve fund in the Saturn vaults. What? Anna declared. Captain, this is highly... We will discuss it after the meeting, Captain Zenith interrupted. He looked back at the other side of the table. So, Mr. Hall, do we have an accord? Dick Hall sat in stunned silence as all eyes turned to him. He looked at each man quickly, wondering what exactly he was supposed to say. I guess I can't exactly say no. Excellent. I'll have our boys in accounting draw up the funds and move a few things around. You should be hearing from us in about a week's time. That'll give you plenty of time to get things organized, and it'll provide us the time to speak to your current employers. Captain Zenith leaned back and glanced at each man who sat at the table. Well then, gentlemen, I'd declare this meeting adjourned. I expect reports on all progress in at least 2 weeks. We'll advance on everything from there. He walked out of the room with his head held high as Anna and Thad followed closely on his heels. The other 5 remained sitting, a little too shocked to rise right away. Particularly Dick Hall, who just stared at the table in front of him. If what he had just heard was accurate, he'd become a millionaire overnight. Captain, Anna Petrov began. Not until we're alone, Zenith replied. The 3 strode through the halls on the 80th floor, everyone stepping out of their way or giving a quick, "Good afternoon, Captain," in acknowledgement. A few quick twists down the halls brought them to a set of double doors. A golden nameplate upon them read Captain Rook Zenith. They slid open upon the captain's approach and revealed the immaculate office beyond. Rook walked to the liquor cabinet along the northern wall, picking up a bottle of scotch and a fine crystal goblet. "Are we alone enough now for you?" Anna asked her old friend. "Speak your mind, Anna. I won't stop you." He dropped an ice cube in the glass and began to pour a small amount of the aged drink. "Oh, you won't?" she asked, the attitude noticeable. "Well then, let me start by asking what in hell you think you just did?" "We ran the projections for the subway system. It never went higher than just under 1 million, Thad said in agreement. "Now you want to offer the man 5? Rook turned back to face his 2 associates. "The 5 million was merely an incentive for Mr. Hall to join our side." "And why not just find somebody else?" Anna asked. "Because I want him. He's the best this city has to offer. Dick Hall has worked on more successfully completed projects than any other man or woman in New Zenith. If anyone can get it done, it's Hall." "Okay, for sake of argument, let's say what you say is true," Anna consented. "You can't offer up Saturn funds anytime you see fit." "Anna, please. You and I both know that money is just sitting in the bank gaining interest. We have close to $1 billion to spare if we need to." Rook took a sip from his glass and sat in his red leather reclining chair. "Billions that are not for you to just throw around!" Anna leaned over the desk and stared at him. Rook had always admired this woman. Despite nearly pushing 80 years old, she still held the ferocity he saw from her all those years ago. "If you're taking money from the Saturn fund, then you have to let myself and Ethan know about it. What do you think he'll do when he finds out that some of his money is just gone?" "I'll handle Major Soldat, Anna." "I'll handle it, Anna. I'll handle it, Anna. That is what you always say." "And I will. We're supposed to be team, Rook. Has that changed now too?" "Really?" Rook Zenith stood up and stared his oldest friend back. "Are you really asking if I've turned my back on you now? Saturn may be over, but we're still here, aren't we? I haven't forgotten that." "Then why are you making this deal without consulting anyone? You think that because your name is on the city, you can just do whatever you want? Of course not. There are limits to even my status as this place's leader. I know that." Rook closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It had been a long day, and this wasn't helping. He may as well tell her the truth. Anna, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to deceive or keep you in the dark. I've just been playing this one a little close to the chest. He looked at his assistant next. Thad, may we have the room, please? Actually, you can go home if you want. We should be done for the day. Thad looked from one to the other. Yeah? Sure? Are you sure? I'm sure, Thad, thank you. Anna looked back at the young man. If you see my daughter on way out, tell her I won't be much longer. Okay. Thad slowly began to head to the double doors. See you both on Monday, I guess. Captain Zenith gave a nod and a final wave at the boy. They waited until the door had closed firmly behind them before continuing. What are you hiding, Rook? I know you. You've always got some ace up your sleeve. What is it this time? A small smile crept its way onto the captain's face. You've always known me better than I know myself, Anna. The captain reached over to the keyboard sitting on his mahogany desk and hit the power button. The large landscape painting behind him raised up into the ceiling, revealing the enormous monitor behind it. Alpha online, he said. I am here, Captain, said the AI. Alpha was Rook's personal digital assistant and had been on board his ship when he had crash-landed just over 65 years ago. He had moved her into his private offices when the building had been constructed. Bring up the Eden files, Rook commanded. A small siren went off once. I am unable to do that, Captain. I was instructed to only access those files when we were alone. Override code RZ771. Another noise was heard from the ceiling, this one like the first 3 notes to bad elevator music. Override code acknowledged. Accessing Eden files. The monitor lit up and showed the blueprint of an aircraft. What do you see, Anna? Your ship, obviously, she told him. I'd recognize it anywhere. That's right. I know you know the story. That ship was an experimental aircraft, the best the 28th century had to offer. And me, being their best pilot, was tasked with flying it for the first time. Yes, Captain, I do know the story. He looked her dead in the eyes, his smile remaining. What if I told you that you didn't? Anna's face rarely showed emotion, but Rook had come to know the subtle facial tics of his old friend. The tiny change in her eyebrow line was the closest thing to shock she would ever let slip. When I was flying the ship, something went wrong and one of the engines imploded. I was coming in too fast, but I knew that a jump would help cushion the blow and possibly keep me alive. That, as you know, is how I wound up back in the year 1945. He looked back to the monitor. Alpha, load slide 2. Yes, Captain. The first image shrank down to the corner of the screen to be replaced with something new. Something Anna hadn't seen before. It was enormous, at least 10 times bigger than Captain Zenith's single-manned ship. Its sides were smooth and orb-shaped, with a few prongs and spikes sticking out of them in concentric patterns from top to bottom. What is that? Anna asked. Captain Zenith pointed to the first image. That was my ship. Then to the second one. And that is what I was towing behind me. He paused and looked back at his friend. I'm afraid I lied all those years ago, Anna. It wasn't a test flight. I was transporting something. Something that has been lost. Something that I've been looking for a very long time. Anna fixed the captain with her eyes. He had her now. She couldn't resist the intrigue he had presented before her. What is it? She asked. He picked up his glass once more and held it before his eyes, enjoying the sight of it for a few moments. Are you a religious woman, Anna? Because I've found the Garden of Eden. and it's been right under our feet this whole time. He drank, and far away in the distance, the first bolt of lightning split the sky. End of Chapter 2. So, we finally get to see Captain Zenith, the apex hero of this entire story. I know he didn't really do much in this chapter. It was more a political kind of get to know the character sort of thing, but don't worry, he'll get more developed just like everybody else will. If you like that, click like. If you want to know when every new chapter comes out, click subscribe, and I'll be able to get another one up there within a week to a month, given however my schedule plays out. But don't worry, there'll always be another one coming out. This is going to be a very big story, and I'm only just getting started. So, see you next time.